Hello, good morning all, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining the webinar today. We have a very interesting webinar lined up here. My name is Dirk Nuyens. I'm senior partner at ERM, over 25 years with the company. I'm assisting steel companies all over the world in their transformation towards, sustainable steel. Also working as account director for one of the largest steel makers, being ArcelorMittal, and also part of the Responsible Steel Initiative for ERM. So thanks for joining today. The title of today's session is actually, as you have seen in the invite, is the co-creation of green steel. And why? Because, against the backdrop of the accelerated net zero actions across the steel industry, there lies, of course, the concern that how the investors in the industry and the value chain can drive this transformation. And as you will see from the discussion today, it's a multifaceted type of challenge that we are facing. It's a pressure along the full steel value chain, and it's definitely more than just carbon zero. So the tunnel vision that responsible steel is just purely zero carbon driven is not really the full picture. So we have an excellent panel lined up today for the session, and but I would like to discuss first, the house rules, if that's okay for you. So we of course we want an active participation, so you can post your questions at any time in the Q&A function that you have in the invite and the Zoom box where you're actually assisting. We will discuss the questions at the end of the presentation. There's a Q&A at the end. We will be recording the webinar, and this is just purely for internal ERM purposes. Materials will be available after the completion of the webinar. And if you have any additional questions or thoughts, we encourage you actually to come back after the webinar. There will also be a survey, as you will see. So feel free to touch base with us if you have any questions or queries on the webinar. So this is just the house rules, and then we go to the panelists. And I'm really proud to have these great panelists attending, and a special thank you to Anne-Claire, who actually woke up very early, as she's also like me based in Europe. And so Anne-Claire is the CEO of Responsible Steel. So welcome, Anne-Claire. Bonjour. Then we have, and Bart, please apologize me if I mispronounce your name. It's Bart Kolodijnik. So I buy you a beer first time we meet. So okay, apologize for that, Bart. And I think Paul Maleshka from Lend-Lease. I think that was better pronounced. So, but also buy you a beer. Don't worry about that, Paul. And then my colleague from the Japanese operations, and senior partner Tomu Mashiba, is also attending for ERM to give a perspective from what we see in the market. So thanks for joining, everybody. I think we can go to the next slide, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, there's a polling question. And the first polling question that we have, just as a sort of warm-up for the session, if you can actually show the polling question, would be great if you could look into this question and answer this. It's just to get a feel on who's attending, and what type of participants we have in the box, and it can help us actually during the session. So what is your role in steel value chain across Asia Pacific? And, are you a steel producer, are you an investor, or are you a steel consumer? So we'd be interested to see what the cocktail is of attendees today. So please take a little bit of time to respond. I think we will see the outcome of the polling short after. Okay, that's good. It's a good mix. Also great to see that we see the full value chain, and we also see a lot of investors attending, so that's great. So thanks for responding that. So we have a good spectrum attending, so great to see that. So today we will be focusing on three discussion areas to make it really meaningful, purposeful, and outcome-based as a webinar for everybody. So we'll be looking at three key issues, being what's the definition of green steel and its business impact and drivers. We will try to discover how we can map out the goals and possibly the solutions that could include hydrogen and other solutions like carbon capture and transformation into maybe bio chemicals, and then also delivering to translate the aspirations to local and practical actions with a good understanding of how the steel value chain will take place in Asia Pacific, because this is indeed something that started mainly initially in Europe, but now is actually rolling over all over the globe. Maybe if the panelists all can go on camera, that would be great. I think everybody's on camera, so that would please do so. Let's go to the first set of questions then. So some define green steel as just simply steel with the lowest carbon footprint currently possible, which will of course vary from producer to producer, and it will continue to evolve over time. It's clear the term is in a way sort of nebulous, and I would like to ask the panelists actually, is there a standard way or platform to define what we mean by green steel? And please weave in maybe Paul or Anne-Claire, you would like to take that question?
I'm happy to kick it off. Thank you, Dirk. It is kind of my bread and butter to try and actually define what we mean by green steel. And I agree. I think the big challenge today is that there is no definition, which is why what you're seeing in the marketplace is every different player coming up with their own definition of what green steel is. And that's great because, the markets hate a void. So people are filling in a need in the market by creating their own definitions. But, we can't even, or haven't even come yet to an agreement globally on what low carbon steel looks like, even what reduced carbon steel looks like. What we do know is that there is a demand for it and there is a need for it given the circumstances. And I think, and you've touched on it in your introduction, for us at least as Responsible Steel, what's really important is, yes, the GHG emissions intensity of steel production and the steel value chain, because it is the emissions from mining all the way to the downstream customer. That aspect is absolutely critical. It's fundamental to the survival of our species, pretty much. But it doesn't mean we can forget all of the other environmental, social, and governance aspects linked to the steel supply chain. And I'll touch briefly on a couple of those. The first one is obviously steelmaking itself, which is still, a risky industry. There are still way too many incidents, labor rights and human rights that aren't respected. So it's not just about carbon. Water stewardship, which will become increasingly a challenge for the steel industry moving forward. And then the other aspect is, if you move upstream of steelmaking, is the mining footprint of the steel industry, which is huge. Iron ore is the most mined material in the world, and the vast majority of it goes into steelmaking. So how do you ensure that that entire supply chain is not just low carbon and has a clear pathway to carbon reduction, but also that it is responsible in so many other ways?
Yeah, that's great, because it's true. It's just more than just carbon friendly steel, as you say. Bart, Paul, you have any thoughts from your perspective?
No, I think, look, Anne-Claire nailed it. We often talk about green steel, but to really talk about green steel, we need to start talking about green iron ore, because today there is not a single producer that makes green iron ore, whatever that definition of green iron ore would be. But to talk about green steel, we need to basically start with our feedstock. So yeah, I completely agree.
And Paul, from your end?
Yeah, so from a user and consumer end, we're really looking for the clarification and definitions. And I'll give a good shout out to Responsible Steel to be able to help us or steer the industry and to be able to give clear guidance as to what the it can be defined as for the industry and then the end users. So thank you, Eric and Claire.
Yeah. And Tomu, from practical experience in the field, from our end, what can you add on that?
Yeah, I can share the more Asian perspectives, and I think in Asia it's pretty much we talked about efficiency of production, and for instance in Korea it's POSCO invested since 1992 about the new smelting reduction process called FINEX. So it's more like improving the process of steelmaking process, and then later, company realizing they are quite polluting compared with other sectors, so they more focus on talking about sustainability. Like Claire said, it's not only just on the carbon emissions, and more talking about labor issues and human rights and the other perspective of sustainable development goals, for instance. But more recently, I think it's people moving toward the carbon neutrality and more talking about zero emission steel making, and for instance, Japan Iron Steel Federation, and also they declared the realization of their zero carbon steel by 2050, and each company also setting the zero carbon goals. So it's pretty much focus on discussion. It's coming to the more climate change and more carbon emissions.
Well, thanks for sharing. I think this is a great start. Anne-Claire, I think with Responsible Steel, you're working towards creating best practice and even certification for green steel. Can you maybe shed some light on what you're doing and where you are on that?
Yeah, happy to do so. So Responsible Steel was set up not that long ago, about 5-6 years ago, and we now have 120 members across the globe. Which encompass the whole steel value chain, but also civil society. And the reason why I say that now is that if you're looking at setting a standard, setting a definition of what green steel is, it can't just be the industry making a determination for itself of what that responsible production of steel looks like. You need the entire stakeholders involved in this. And this is what we've been trying to do with Responsible Steel through a painful consensus-driven process, which I'm sure some of our members could describe much more accurately than me. But the key definition is, first of all, you have to look at the site, so the steel mill itself. And what we have there is we have the Responsible Steel Site Standard, which is this holistic ESG certification that I talked about. So which looks at labor rights, human rights, biodiversity, and everything else. What we're currently finalizing, and fingers crossed I won't jinx it, but we're hoping to release that standard in the next couple of months, is the standard for certified steel. So the crude steel that comes out of the mill. And there, obviously, the site would have to be certified against all of these ESG standards, which means this already reassures you as a consumer that at least the site you're purchasing from is a responsible site. Then the steel itself will have to meet additional requirements, obviously a greenhouse gas emissions intensity performance criteria. And there, I'm sure that any of you have been involved in all of the numerous discussions across the globe around defining what the right level of performance is, will know how tricky it is. But the approach we've chosen to take, first of all, is to not be restrictive. And we need to understand that the industry is going through a massive transition. So it's not about rewarding just good performance today, because if you're fortunate enough to have an electric arc furnace in a country that relies essentially on hydro, your footprint is already essentially relatively low. Your emissions will mostly come from the energy you consume or from the mined products that you're getting into your furnace. But we wanted to find a way to reward or to incentivize the production of lower carbon steel, not just of ultra low carbon steel, but to lower the whole production chain. And taking into account also the role that scrap and circularity will play increasingly, because we all know that, yes, the easy equation, and I'm sure that the scientists among us will talk about this much better than me, but the easy solution is just increase the scrap content in your steel. And if you've got an electric arc furnace, hey presto, it's quite simple. But the world is more complex than that. And the beauty of steel is that it is in everything, and it is fundamentally part of everyone's supply chain. I don't think there's a single stakeholder that doesn't have steel in it. Even steelworks are made of steel. It's literally everywhere. And if you look at, I don't know if, I'm sure people saw the recent McKinsey study looking at the important, materials in the energy transition. steel is the only one that's essential to every single technology and every single solution that we have moving forward. So for us, it's really important that we come to a common definition that people can agree on, and that can be used not just by, buyers of steel, but also specifiers. You're an architect, you can specify for a certain grade of steel. More importantly, you're in public procurement. Public procurement is 40% of steel use. If governments, if public procurement can incentivize people to use responsibly produced steel, you've already got a massive win on your side. So it's about, responsible steel is really a tool. It's how can you give people a benchmark, because people are hungry for this, which is why you're seeing so many definitions of green steel in the market, is people want something that they can rely on. And hopefully through a multi-stakeholder process and involving the whole value chain, we can come to that definition.
Yeah, and as you say, I think the demand is growing more rapidly than anticipated, which is great. I think it's just showing the the need for creating responsible steel or green steel. What we see at ERM, if I can say, what we see as green steel from the market, it's indeed a convergence like you have on responsible steel, Anne-Claire. It's indeed, bringing together the responsible mining and responsible steel concept, but then looking, into what I would say sustainably manufactured steel, but then along, the steel value chain. And this, along the best applicable ESG practices within the context of the, the local context. And of course, there's a risk that we focus too much, as you say, on purely on the carbon, because at the moment that's the topic, right? It's a tunnel vision. But as you say, more and more downstream users of steel are also getting more interested in how safe is the steel being produced. Do we have fatalities in the steel mills, for example? What about inclusion, diversity of the workforce? And so, as you say, I think it's far more than just, carbon. And that's what I like about responsible steel as a concept, Anne-Claire. So I'm a supporter, that. So great. I want to go to the next block, which I think is really more about, we recently had the COP26 and, the drive green steel and the net zero drivers. And I would like actually to ask a question to Paul, if that's okay. Do we even have a choice in the steel value chain not to go green? And what would be the key considerations and drivers to make green steel, work? Based from your experience, working more at the, downstream user side at Lendlease, I'm really keen to get your insights on that.
Thank you. We certainly don't have a choice. We certainly need to go to green steels or low carbon steels and eventually to absolute zero. It's certainly what Lendlease has put on a flag on the hill, not only net zero, but absolute zero by 2040. And we've created a carbon action plan. We've called it Mission Zero, but we don't produce the steel. So our clients want it. We want it. We're a real estate development business. We educate our clients and our consultants, and we're bringing along the end users, but they're demanding it right now. And we understand that there's a transition. We need to work with the industry. We need to work with the science and the technology, and we're funding our projects. We're giving promises on delivering. We're actually getting a premium on that promise to have a greener project or a less carbon intense for our clients, and so therefore we need to deliver. So we need the industry to come along with us, and we were a founding member of Responsible Steel, also a founding member of Steel Zero. Steel Zero is a collaboration of organisations that are trying to be leaders in driving a net zero or towards net zero or absolute zero. So from many perspectives, so the social side, environmental side, client side, finance side, and just internally at Lendlease, we want this, we need this, the world needs this. Well, I won't say the faster the better, but we understand there's a transition, but and we're on the right path. And it's discussions like this that give me a good heart, and working across the whole value chain right through from the finance and production, from mills, mines, through to processors and to us. So everyone's educated. Everyone knows there's a strong demand there. We can get a premium for our products, and therefore the steel products that have green, a first advantage mover, certainly will be able to give supply to the market will be an advantage. So
going green actually creates a market differentiator for you. That's
definitely
important. Yeah, super. Thanks for sharing that, Paul. Bart, with your recent G20 presentation, what's your take on this? Keen to get your intel on that, your insights.
Sure. So Dirk and the audience, late last year, together with a few colleagues in Italy, we have co-authored a policy paper for G20 Summit that was presented at G20 Summit and received actually quite a bit of interest, especially from OECD, which is a good sign. In this policy paper, we effectively discussed that steelmaking industry can be a great enabler for hydrogen economy. But effectively, in this current context that we are discussing today, it's a bit of a closed cycle because, hydrogen can be great enabler for steel as well. So, steel industry is large enough and emits roughly 8% of global CO2 emissions. So, the low-hanging fruit today would be to probably use, clean or green reductant in steelmaking process and, reuse or retool existing infrastructure. For that reason, that would be a low-hanging fruit. But at the same time, today's green hydrogen is not cost-effective. It's not produced at scale. So, those two industries can actually enable each other. That was our point.
Yeah. Indeed, you need to transition, as you say, because it's not something that's going to happen just overnight. Green hydrogen at a reasonable price. So that's why you need hybrid solutions actually to get through the transition. So yeah, thanks. Tommy, what do you see in North Asia within that context?
Yeah, I think it's like, like demand of sustainable steel, it's still not that strong, or like pressure from investors still coming in. But also I see that some trend and the steel company actually actively, promoting kind of their, new way of producing steel. For instance, JFE and issued the first transition bond and for that they're improving their efficiency. So they are taking advantage of getting sustainability related bonds and to get new financing, and which is quite interesting. And even Japanese government and the financial agency, and they set up the new guideline for sustainable bond and the financing and based on green bond principles, and which is kind of government is also pushing financial institutions and the shift and their direction of investment in the like more greener steel, but also other sustainable products and services.
Yeah, you're right, because the transition will cost billions of money for all the companies involved in steel. So the investors have a very important role to play on that, because you cannot make it happen just purely on your own, return. So you need support. And that's why we see a lot of interest, and it's also seen with the participants today. A lot of investors actually are participating. So, but yeah, Tommy, that's great. So only the full value chain, can make it happen. It's not an individual company. It's actually the full ecosystem, the steel ecosystem, that needs to make a transition. And that's an interesting one, because as you say, Bart, 8% of the global emissions, if you look just purely on the emission side, it's a lot. But we need steel, as Anne-Claire said. There's no alternative. So that's an interesting conundrum. I like it a lot. So let's now focus on how we can set pragmatic medium and long-term targets to advance in that green steel journey. And for a steel producer, Bart, do you think that renewables will be incorporated into future production, and which emerging tech would you think it will be evolve as the more dominant enabler to make that progression happen?
So look, I think renewables are starting to be implemented in that steel making process. There are a few smaller scale pilot projects, specifically in Europe, in Germany, mainly run by ThyssenKrupp, and there is also hybrid in Sweden. Those two technologies actually rely on hydrogen as a green reductant. I guess, as I mentioned just there, hydrogen pathway is probably the low-hanging fruit because there is a lot of infrastructure that already exists and that can be retooled as long as we can produce cost-effective hydrogen at scale. There will be some issues with today's supply of electrolyzers. They are not produced at scale, so it will probably take a couple of years to ramp it up. But reusing that existing infrastructure will be probably straightforward, or the easiest way. And then there are some emerging technologies like electrochemical pathways, whether those are high temperature or low temperature. High temperature, there is a company in the US called Boston Metal, which is a spin-off from MIT. It's basically high temperature electrochemical process. There might be some issues with that process because it operates at high temperature. I'm not sure how easily it will follow intermittent load from wind and solar. But there are also electrochemical pathways that allow to reduce iron ore at very low temperature. And only last week I talked to a Polish startup that is developing similar technology. There is also Electra Steel in Colorado that is also developing electrowinning technology. There is a research program run in Belgium by ArcelorMittal together with a number of partners where they are also doing electrowinning. So, hydrogen is probably the most mature. Hydrogen together with biofuels used in traditional steel making infrastructure. But there are some very interesting, I guess, emerging technologies that will probably take another 5 to 10 years to mature. And, if you are to deploy new steel making operation, that technology in the future might be actually very viable. Those electrochemical technologies also tend to be significantly more selective, so they can take more impurities in your iron ore feedstock. Obviously, those that operate at low temperature, they can easily follow intermittent power supply. And also those electrochemical technologies tend to be more efficient. So, and lower in CapEx, because effectively, you don't need electrolyzer plant together with your direct reduced iron plant or blast furnace. You just use, single electrochemical device.
Yeah, and I think you clearly indicate that some of these technologies still need to mature, and I think the challenge is indeed the upscaling, because steel plant 1 million ton per year production, it's a different scale, as you know, Bart. But I think what we see happening in Europe, but also outside of Europe, is actually the clustering of steel makers with energy companies and downstream chemical offtake. And carbon capture, type of solutions where you can see industrial clusters actually being regenerated, which I think is also an interesting move. I would also like, from your end, Paul, and this is more from the consumer side. So, how from your end can green steel support, the net zero transition and competitive advantage? You already responded a little bit already in the first question, but maybe you can add some more.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly, steel represents a huge portion of our Scope 3 emissions. So a couple of stats, we spend about 6% of our total spend on all our structures and all our works globally on steel products, 6%, but it represents about 40% of our Scope 3 emissions. So if we do nothing in this zone, well, obviously we'll just won't be able to hit our interim targets. But we can see, as Bart sort of said, there is some low-hanging fruit and there's many horses in the race on which technology to use. We understand that there's a transition. As an end user, we're not the scientists here, but we're relying on the experts around us and the steel that's available in the local markets. And so working with those in each region, you understand that there is some highlights for that are on the best track for now. But as Anna-Claire said before, we want the whole industry to be transitioning. I think there's something like 1,500 different steels in the marketplace to support, and 50% are for construction. So you need virtually not every, but many steel mills and many different technologies and styles of construction of mills production. And we recognise this that goes into all the products that come into all of our structures. So the transition is vital, and to get that competitive advantage, to be able to hit our targets and then deliver for our clients, we understand we need to be supporting the industry for those transition. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great, Paul. But I'm also wondering, in your business model, on recycling, and refurbishing, that's something you design, really, right, for reuse. Is that correct?
Yes, so certainly looking for more and more whole of life design and to be able to capture steel. So traditionally we'll demolish a building and what the structures weren't designed for reuse, and you may be able to recycle them, which is I guess the current technology. So yeah, Lendlease is and many others are now looking to how can we reuse or repurpose either in its original form or a secondary form, and then design buildings around those componentries and or those that can be used. So obviously concrete structures has steel in them and the steel could be recycled, but a steel section or steel structure, the whole sections and whole components can be bolted, unbolted and reused as whole units. And so then it becomes, I might say, indefinite, but many uses, and the carbon reductions much less across many structures.
Thanks. And from the steel investor side, and maybe that's a question for Anna-Claire, there's a need to quantify and disclose progress, and that's clear. It's also to get access to investment. So what are the key areas that steel investors are currently focusing on to see whether effective corporate sustainability governance is being applied within the steel companies applying for funding? What's your perspective on that, Anna-Claire?
Yeah, it's quite a busy space at the moment, and I say it's quite geographically. The approaches geographically are quite different. Obviously, we've all spoken about Europe at length, and there we're already seeing bonds being tied to performance on carbon emissions. We've seen credit facilities, for instance, revolving credit facilities with responsible steel certification as a KPI or a performance indicator. So what we've seen, but investors are also still debating what the pathway looks like for the transition of the steel economy. There's huge number of conversations ongoing around, well, what is the transition like? How do we know that the assets we've invested in is on the right track? What is the right track for the steel industry? And in the preparation for COP26 in Glasgow, I think there was literally a report being produced every week around what the transition pathways for steel look like. So we're still debating what this transition needs to look like in order to help investors make the right investment decisions. But if you want to be quite simplistic about it, in my mind, there's a number of things you need to be considering, and some investors are already doing that, which is, okay, you need to look at steel as an industry, but obviously as an investor, you're investing in specific companies or specific assets. So the industry's transition is important. And as we've touched on already, is there are a number of low-hanging fruits. So we're seeing a lot of investment going into that already. I think, companies who are putting in place new technology for steelmaking or new greenfield sites are not struggling to get access to finance. The access to finance is relatively simple for them. But where the bulk of the money is required is on steel mills being built today in places like India and China to ensure that they are more sustainable and that their footprint is lowered. The tricky question there is they can't apply that new technology right now. So what's the transition technology that enables them then to transition quicker to these new technologies when they are proven, when they are put in place at scale, etc. The other aspect is, okay, so you look at a company's portfolio of assets and you will have some low performing sites and some high performing sites. So how do you make sure that the investment is not necessarily going into what's doing well today, but in what needs to do better tomorrow? And that's the real challenge when you're facing as an investor the need to decarbonize your own portfolio, because you also have metrics and you also have commitments, and you've said to your shareholders, I will reduce my carbon footprint as an investor. And the problem is, if we're all focused on the low, GHG footprint today, you're going to see a lack of investment in how to transition the rest of the industry, which is much trickier. And that's where your real impact will be, because lowering the footprint of a steel mill that's already low today, you're not really going to have a massive impact on climate change as a whole. Whereas if you drag the low performers today into better performance tomorrow, just reducing their carbon footprint by 50% has a massive impact on the steel sector's emissions. So I think for investors, it's really hard, because they're caught between a bit similar to the steelmakers, which is we need good performance today, but we're also required to finance the transition of the sector. And it's really challenging, and it's about having access to data, which is always a massive challenge. What data are you looking for? How do you get it? Is it actually comparable? Because I can throw whatever GHG numbers at you from my steel mill. Do you actually know what they're comprised of? Are they just looking at scope 1 and 2? There's a real pushback from the industry to include, scope 3 in this, because it's complicated. But as we've discussed already today, you can't ignore scope 3, because it's absolutely fundamental when it comes to steelmaking. So it's for us, and that's where, again, responsible steel tries to be a tool. It's about how can you compare different mills with each other and compare like for like and look at performance across the value chain.
That's actually a very great remark, what you make. And so there's still a lot of work ahead, to do a sort of more objective type of screening, as you say. There's a lot of things happening in already, work and progress is being made. But thanks for sharing, Anne-Claire. I think it would be great to have a second polling question at this stage, if that's okay. The second polling question is, maybe can pop up if that's okay. So where's your organization now in this journey towards green steel, its future? Is it already, have you already clear goals and taking actions to drive green steel? Are you just setting the goals and planning the actions? Or are you lobbying the goals and taking initial action plans? Interested to see what the outcome of that polling would be. And unfortunately, the panelists cannot vote, because we would already know what the answer would be of the panelists. Okay. So there's some leaders of the pack and the peloton and some, okay, that's really great. So it's also there, a diverse response. So great, thanks for sharing. But with this, I think it would be meaningful for the attendees today to share some best practices on what we see in the industry. And Bart, you have a good perspective, having worked as chief scientist at Fortescue. So maybe you can shed some light on that.
So look, I think the best practice as of today would be effectively that initial pilot plant that was developed by Hybrid. I would say it's probably the best practice today, because this is the most developed one and the highest scale. Some other good practices, my colleagues at Rio Tinto, for example, are experimenting with biochar. So that's a great step forward. It's quite easy and straightforward to implement, but might be a game changer. And then I personally am very excited about those emerging technologies, purely because they are quite high tech. And as a nerd, I like high tech. But also, those emerging technologies, electrochemical processes, actually bring a massive shift to a paradigm change. Suddenly, with those small and modular scalable technologies, you don't need billions of dollars of investment. You don't need very large operations. You can actually use modular systems to produce either green iron and convert it further to steel, or green steel directly from iron ore. And what that allows you to do is to decentralize that steel production and same time, you know, democratize it, which is quite exciting.
That's great. Anne-Claire or other colleagues, do you have something to share with respect of that question?
I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to pretend that I can beat Bart on the technology side, because, you know, leave the experts to do what they do best. No, what I think is really important to note, and it's something that's really struck me in the industry, is the amount of collaboration that's happening across the value chain. And I think that's something absolutely unique that we're seeing, you know, mining companies that are working with steel makers directly. We're seeing steel makers working with their consumers. We're seeing the whole value chain come together to address a common problem. And that's quite exhilarating, you know, in a world where all we hear is bad news all the time. I think it's really positive to highlight the amount of collaboration that's happening within the industry and with their different stakeholders. And I think, you know, if anything, that's what's leading to these new technologies being developed and these solutions that are being found is through cross value chain collaboration. And I haven't seen that happen in many other sectors in the past. I think it's something quite unique that's happening now. And it's quite, you know, it does fill you with a sense of hope, which is quite rare these days.
You're right. I think based from what I see in the market is that it's like a catalyst. You know, it's like a snowball coming down the mountain. Actually, it's picking up speed and size, and a lot of companies and along the whole value chain are surprised that actually it's going more rapidly than they initially had in their initial plans, I think, and then that's a good thing. And this is because, as you say, Anne-Claire, there's far more collaboration and sharing of information and best practice, and you know, so instead of propriety, confidential, and whatever, everybody understands that working together is going to be far more, you know, effective and get to the end result much quicker. I think that's really great, and I think the steel industry is a good example, actually. Of the transition, which I think we should publish more and make more, scream more about, Anne-Claire. So yeah, thanks. I think we can go to the, yes, please.
If I can just echo that.
Please.
Certainly, we're as the end user, we're traditionally dealing with fabricators or processors, but now we're reaching down into the mills and further. So talking also to the mines as well to understand the whole process. So that we are looking to have ownership of the steel, and it is being echoed. So we're, so Nucor and is sort of launched with you know, cars or Volvos. You know, everyone wants a brand, and steel is being brought along with them. Yeah, I want one for buildings, so and so I'm looking too. And it is putting the steel makers and processors front and center, which maybe they haven't had, you know, the limelight, but you've got it now. So let's take it.
And in terms of collaboration, as mentioned by Anne-Claire, I guess hybrid is the best practice again here, because you know this consortium actually brings three major stakeholders. So iron ore producer, steel maker, and energy company, you know, they all bring very unique sets of skills to this consortium, and by doing that, they actually enable that transition.
It's the clustering approach, Bart, as I mentioned, that is happening, and this is great. I mean, the boundaries in between companies are actually no longer there. I mean, they're used as an opportunity. We see the same happening in Europe with, you know, wind farm producers looking into steel makers, and then at the end, the wind farms will generate, you know, green energy for. So that's also a very nice concept of circularity, right? So, and maybe Tomi, you see the same happening in Japan or North Asia, right?
Yeah, pretty much the same. But also, you know, they're kind of feeling a lot of pressure from the investors and stop investing in the coal, and but also, you know, consumers and aside, they wish to have a green steel. The pressure is really changing the game, and very, very fast.
Right. I think it would be good to go to the last block, and then we can go to the Q&A if that's okay. So thanks for sharing your views on the, you know, the challenges on the steel value chain, and we will, indeed have an interesting shift in the coming 10 years, but we're already moving, quite well in the right direction, as we can hear from the discussion. So, Tomu, where is the metal and mining industry at the moment on their green steel journey, and what are the key barriers that you see in Asia Pacific, specifically, in North Asia? How does the industry navigate these challenges? What's your perspective?
I think most Asian companies and investing in hydrogen paths and combined with CCS, but it's where the hydrogen come from, and which is a question, and how to get the green hydrogen, and which is quite difficult to get renewable energy source and within the country. So they start making collaboration with Australia or UAE and other country, and try to get shipping green hydrogen to Japan or Korea. That's their rushing into this. But also where the hydrogen to be used, and Japan has a Coast 20 project and funded by Japanese government and organized by Japanese Public Institute and NEDO, and spending 100 millions. But they are using hydrogen into the blast furnace plants and the existing plants, and because of like transitioning to the new plant, it's pretty difficult, and they have no direct and reduction plant and in the country. So, but it is the right choice, and how to kind of make a right transition, and that's quite challenge for the Japanese and the Korean steel making companies.
Bart, Paul, and Anne-Claire, you have anything on that perspective you would like to share with the colleagues? No? Okay, we're now in 22. So what do you think would be the priority actions that we should be looking into for creating an impact within your organization and within the steel value chain, in the broader sense? Would be Anne-Claire, maybe you can take that one.
Thanks. Well, very, very selfishly, from Responsible Steel's perspective, having the Responsible Steel standard be taken up by a majority of steelmakers and their buyers and suppliers for us would be great. But I think for the industry as well, in the sense that it would allow, a common benchmark for every producer. And we are, and I maybe didn't stress it enough, the way the standard is designed is it is completely technology agnostic, which means that we don't have an opinion on what the best technology is moving forward, but what we do recognize is that for different companies and different regions in the world, things will move at a different speed or in a slightly different direction. And you need to empower steelmakers to make the right choices for them as steelmakers based on where they're operating. And the challenges you face in North America are not the same you face in India. And so the transition looks slightly different, but it is ultimately about that end objective. And then for us, it's really about how can we support, the industry in this transition, and how can we make sure that no one is left behind. And I was just very briefly looking at some of the questions we've already had in the chat, and some of them touch on exactly that, which is the idea of a just transition. How do you make sure no one is left behind, whether it's your workers, whether it's your stakeholders, whether it's developing economies? How do we make sure that this transition doesn't actually harm some parts of the world more than others? And usually the parts that are most affected by climate change are the ones that are most likely to be left behind in the first place. So there's a sense of how do you ensure that this transition is equitable, and how do you ensure, and that's why for us, it can't just be about carbon. It has to be about the whole ESG spectrum, because we cannot afford to have a negative impact on the other side of the equation because we're so single-mindedly focused on carbon.
Well, Anne-Claire, thanks, because you responded to a couple of questions already there we have in the Q&A, and it's true. It's a balancing act, as you say, and we all have a societal role to play to do what's right? So I think it's indeed an additional, I would say, angle to the transition. It's indeed doing what is socially, correct and equitable, as you say. So that's really a good question, remark. Bart, Paul, anything from your end?
I can add to that one.
Yeah,
I think the priority actions, well, from my end as the end user, is to portray to everyone that there is a demand, a very strong demand, and that education is the first part, and then understanding the time frames and costs and technologies and the like. That's obviously a big part. But really, we need to. I think for myself is to, and our organisation is to sort of say we need this. The demand is there right here right now. If you can produce it, we can sell it, and we can make a competitive advantage and or a profit from selling greener structures, greener buildings. So that's the number one priority from a end user side. That this demand is strong and growing, and so that's number one for me.
Yeah, and you respond also to one of the questions that we have. Is there a willingness to pay a premium actually for green steel? Actually, what we see in Europe, and Anna-Claire, you can confirm, demand for green steel is much higher than what we have in the market, which is amazing. And so I think, you know, the market demand itself that was created, the uptake is so high, which I think is even pushing the transition to a faster modus, which I think is great. So super. Tomu, anything you would like to share from your end on this discussion or reflections? No?
Well, that was a very interesting discussion for us, and you know, all the countries, you know, all the companies going in the same direction, and the question is how much faster we can make you know, this transition, and yeah, looking forward for collaboration.
Okay. I've got it's really great, and I would like to open, you know, the floor for questions. And I see a couple of questions coming in that we have not responded yet. And so the first question that I see here is how important is getting all participants along the supply chain to collaborate in raising the sustainability levels? What are the main challenges to this collaboration, and is it likely we will see supply chains decommoditize to enable this collaboration? That's a good question. Who's willing to take that one?
I might have a start with some support from others.
Thanks, Paul.
I'm certainly I'm in supply chain, so and I'll shout out to everyone that I've had a chat to from BlueScope, Nippon, ArcelorMittal, Nucor, so across the globe, some of the larger and big and small, all the way from to the mills, to the mines. Everyone's got to be on board, certainly. And how do we then tell everyone and get everyone on board at the same time? The technology is developing. Everyone needs to be aware of which technology there is, but as end users, I need to be able to know that it's the flow through of the products is going to eventually come to me, and at what time? Sure, it's still unknown at this stage, but everyone's working hard. So I just want to say, yeah, the whole value chain it needs to be on board for sure. Anyone else want to add to that?
Well, I think I touched on it already to a certain degree, but I like the second part of the question because I can't actually answer it, but I think it's an important one, which is around, you know, the decommoditization of steel, because one of the big drawbacks is obviously steel is a global market, and it's viewed as a commodity in this space, and yes, that will change. You know, we're seeing a lot of direct, you know, offtake agreements. Some of the new projects are literally a collaboration between the buyer and the producer already. Whether that'll have a bigger impact on decommoditization, well, I'd probably be much wealthier than I am if I knew. But I think it's really important to think: is this going to change the way the market looks at steel beyond it being as a commodity or as something else? And it's something, yeah, I'd actually love to sit in a discussion to hear more about what, you know, traders and other parts in the value chain think about this.
But there's a lot of similarities, Anna-Claire, on what is being seen as a challenge also for the copper and the nickel and the electrifying metals. So I think, you know, as you say, the commoditizing is an important one. As we see that, you know, prime resources are getting more and more scarce, and we need to be more, I mean, yeah, there needs to be an upwards upgrading of the product itself. So yeah, that's a really good question. I like that a lot. The question also is with and definitely what we see with the energy prices in Europe is, can this transition happen without any inflation? How do we deal with the social impact of this inflation? And that's a real big question. I like that one. Thanks, Lee, for sharing that one. Nobody wants to take...
Not that we're actually going to answer you on that one.
No, Anne-Claire, I know. No, don't worry. I didn't point it to you.
I think it's, again, it's a great question because it buys into the whole idea of the just transition, because there are externalities to everything we do. And how do we take that into account? And fundamentally, there's one stakeholder that we very rarely mention and yet has a massive role to play, is the government and government policies and what frameworks need to be put in place to ensure that this transition is just and equitable. And I think that's the one stakeholder that's always missing from a lot of the discussions we have within the private sector, is the massive role that the government has to play in all of this.
Well, and the role not only in partly funding and making it, creating the boundaries and the playing field, but also an infrastructure, I think, is also important. We shouldn't underestimate. If we go hydrogen, we need to create it. Just look at Europe. I mean, the whole network in Europe needs to be, adjusted to get these streams of hydrogen towards the clusters going. So that's an interesting one. But what I see happening from my end in Europe and in the US then is there's a lot of money already being set aside by companies, by governments, towards companies to help the transition. I mean, there's more than 1 billion, for example, in Spain. There's in France. It's happening in Canada, recently announced, actually to help the companies go into the transition. So you're right, Anne-Claire, we all have a role to play. Society as a whole and governments also. So that's part of the transition. It's not only a technical transition. It's not only a transition within the supply chain, as a product, but it's also a transition as a society towards what I would say a more carbon-friendly type of society, with a new mix of energy, and also different uptake financially, on willingness to pay for the circularity. I think that's an important one. So there was one remark made by my colleague Toby, and it's true. And maybe Bart, you can answer that one. We recently looked into net zero LNG cargoes for transporting iron across the globe. Do you think that this would have potential value for iron ore shipments all over? Because there will indeed, different grades of iron ores being transported from Africa, Australia towards, the steel making centers. What's your feel on that?
From what I understand, major iron ore producers are actually looking at either using ammonia or green ammonia in particular, or synthetic methane as a shipping fuel to actually, move away, not only to move away from bunker fuel, which is probably the most polluting fuel you can imagine, but also to move towards something that is completely green or zero carbon. So, companies like Vale, even Fortescue, a few others. It seems to me that Singapore has a very high chance to become, clean fuel hub. So that's actually quite interesting development there.
Yeah. Great. Well, we're at the end of the hour, and I want to stick to the time slot. I thought myself that it was a very interesting discussion. I'm very enthused by the fact that everybody is so motivated in the transition and things are happening, a lot of ideas that are already being implemented in the fields, realizations. There's still a lot of challenges that lie ahead of us. That's clear. But I think, looking into the discussion along the steel value chain with the panelists that we had today, I think there's a lot of opportunities out there, and it's very exciting to be part of the transition. So I would like to thank the panelists. So Anne-Claire, the CEO of Responsible Steel, thank you very much. Bart, I'm not going to try because, I owe you 2 beers. So Bart, who's the former chief scientist of Fortescue. So thanks for joining. And also Paul Neshka, who works at Lend-Lease, and my colleague Tomu. So I also want to thank my other colleagues who assisted in getting the webinar organized. I really appreciate everybody's effort in getting this done. Looking forward also to the feedback from the people attending. If there's any open questions or whatever, feel free to reach out to us at the ERM or the panelists for responding. So with that, I would like to close off. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there is one slide that actually brings you to a survey. I'm not sure whether it will show up now. And Tomo, of course, I thank you too, Tomo, don't worry. I'll buy you a sake.